What happens when the only son you've loved all your life suddenly shows up at your doorstep, not for a visit, but to have you sign the very papers that will evict you from your own home? At 72, Evelyn Hartwell had to face the cruelest truth of her life. The person betraying her wasn't a stranger. It was her own flesh and blood. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, hit the subscribe button now so you don't miss stories like this. Stories of betrayal, dignity, and women who seemed defeated but rose again, stronger than ever. Please hit like to support the channel and leave a comment below with the city or country you're watching from. I'd love to know where in the world Evelyn's story has reached. Now, let's get started. The morning Nathan brought his wife home to meet me for the first time, I made biscuits from scratch. I remember standing at that old gas stove, the one with the left burner that always ran a little hot, rolling out dough with the same wooden pin my mother had given me 40 years before. The kitchen smelled like butter and flour and something warm I couldn't quite name. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was the particular foolishness of a mother who still believed, after everything, that her son was a good man. I'd been nervous all week. I'd cleaned corners of the farmhouse I hadn't touched in years, dusted the photograph frames in the hallway, washed the curtains, put fresh lavender in the guest room, even though they were only coming for lunch. His name was Nathan Hartwell. He was my son, my only child. The boy I raised alone after his father died, working double shifts at the county clerk's office so he could have new shoes every school year, so he wouldn't have to feel the kind of shame that poverty leaves on a child's face. And her name, his new wife, was Victoria. She arrived in the passenger seat of a silver SUV that probably cost more than I'd made in 3 years combined. She was beautiful in the deliberate way of a woman who knows exactly what impression she's making. Silk blouse, structured blazer, hair that looked professionally blown out, not for a casual lunch in rural Tennessee, but for an occasion she considered worth performing for. She shook my hand at the door and smiled. "Evelyn," she said, "not Mrs. Hartwell, not even a hesitant mom. Just my first name, clean and flat. Nathan talks about you all the time." I smiled back. I told her she was lovely. I meant it, the way you mean something before you understand what it costs you. We sat at the kitchen table and ate. Nathan talked about his new consulting firm, about the apartment they'd leased in Nashville, about a vacation they were already planning to Italy. Victoria mostly listened, or she appeared to. But I noticed, in the way older women tend to notice things, that her eyes moved around my kitchen with a particular kind of attention. Not admiration. Assessment. She looked at the farmhouse the way a contractor looks at a building before he decides what to tear down. I told myself I was imagining things. I should tell you something about this farm before I go any further, because it matters. It matters more than I understood at the time. The Hartwell land sits on 43 acres outside of Clarksburg, Tennessee, a small town so quiet that the loudest thing most mornings is the sound of my neighbor Harold's rooster, who has apparently never once in his long life understood what time sunrise actually is. The farmhouse itself was built in 1947. It has creaking floorboards in the hallway and a front porch that sags just slightly on the left side and windows that rattle when the wind comes in from the north. To most people, it looks like a modest old house that a widow lives in because she can't afford anything better. That's what I wanted people to think. What most people didn't know, what Nathan himself didn't fully know, was that the land beneath that old house had been in my family for 3 generations. My grandfather had purchased those 43 acres during a time when most people like him couldn't own anything at all. My father had kept them. My husband Robert had loved them. And when Robert died of a heart attack 11 years ago, everything, the land, a small technology investment he'd made in the late 90s that had quietly tripled in value, and a family trust that his attorney had helped us structure, passed entirely to me. The trust alone was worth slightly over $3 million. I had never told Nathan the full number. I told myself the reason was noble. I didn't want wealth to change him. I wanted him to build something real, something he earned. I'd seen what inheritance did to men who weren't ready for it. I'd watched cousins and neighbors dissolve into their parents' money like sugar in warm water, sweet at first, then gone. But if I'm honest, and I'm trying to be now that it's over, there was another reason too. A quieter one. Somewhere in the back of my mind, in the place where you keep the things you're too proud to say out loud, I think I already knew something was soft in Nathan's character. Not broken, not cruel, just soft. The kind of soft that, under the right pressure, becomes something else entirely. I kept the trust to myself because I was afraid of what my own son might do with the knowledge. I've had a long time to sit with how right I was. The months after Nathan's wedding passed, the way months tend to pass when you're 72 and living alone, unevenly. Some weeks felt full, others stretched out thin and gray. I tended my flower beds. I drove my old pickup into town for groceries. I had coffee with my neighbor Dorothy on Tuesday mornings and argued pleasantly with her about local politics and the best way to treat aphids on rose bushes. Nathan called less than he used to. I told myself that was normal. Newlyweds were busy. Marriage was an adjustment. He was building something with Victoria, and that was good. That was what I wanted for him. The few times he did call, Victoria was always in the background. I could hear her. Not clearly, just the low murmur of a voice that seemed to be steering, somehow, without saying anything I could specifically object to. Nathan started using phrases he hadn't used before. Streamlining, moving forward, looking at the full picture. He asked once, carefully, whether I'd thought about what I was going to do with the farm long term. Live on it, I told him. He laughed, but it didn't reach his eyes, and I could tell even over the phone. 3 months after the wedding, he told me he'd had documents drawn up to give him power of attorney over my affairs. Just as a precaution, he said, because you're living alone out there, Mom, and we worry, and that he'd mailed them for me to sign and return. The envelope arrived. I read every page. I didn't sign anything. I called him back and told him I appreciated the concern, but that I'd already worked with my own attorney, Margaret Caldwell, to have my estate planning in order. There was a pause on the line that lasted a half-second too long. Of course, he said. That's great, Mom. I just want you to be taken care of. I told him I knew that. I didn't believe it, not entirely, but I told him I knew it because that's what you do. You protect the version of your child you still hope is real. You hold on to it like a stone in your pocket, smooth and familiar, long past the point when you should have put it down. The SUV appeared in my driveway on a Thursday morning in October. I was on the porch drinking coffee when they pulled up. Nathan in the driver's seat, Victoria beside him, and a man I didn't recognize climbing out of the back. He was carrying a leather briefcase and wearing the expression of a person who gets paid specifically not to feel uncomfortable in situations like this one. Nathan walked up the porch steps first. He was smiling, but the smile had that same quality I'd noticed at lunch months ago, the quality of something performed rather than felt. Mom, he said. Good morning. Nathan. I looked past him at the man with the briefcase. Who's this? This is Gerald, Victoria said from behind Nathan, stepping forward in a way that told me immediately that she was the one who had planned this morning. He's an attorney. We asked him to come along to help explain some things. Explain what things? I asked. Gerald set his briefcase on the porch railing without being invited to and unclicked the latches with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done something like this before. Mrs. Hartwell, he said, pulling out a thick document and setting it in front of me, there's been a legal transfer of property authority regarding this residence and the attached acreage. This paperwork finalizes the sale process, which began approximately 4 months ago, pursuant to the power of attorney signed in. I didn't sign a power of attorney, I said. He continued as if I hadn't spoken. Signed in July of this year. The property has been listed and has received an accepted offer. You'll need to vacate the premises within 72 hours. We've arranged. I said I didn't sign anything. This time he stopped. He looked at me in the way that certain people look at elderly women. Not with cruelty exactly, but with a particular patient condescension, the way you'd look at someone you'd already decided wasn't quite worth the energy of a real argument. Mrs. Hartwell, your signature is on the documents. He turned the papers so I could see the last page. My name was there. Evelyn Ruth Hartwell. The loops of the E, the slight backward slant I'd always had, the way the H connected to the A in Hartwell. It looked like mine. It had been made to look exactly like mine. But I knew the way I knew my own heartbeat, my own breath, my own hands. I had never put that pen to that paper. I looked up from the documents to Nathan. He was standing 4 feet away with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and he was not looking at me. He was looking at a spot somewhere past my left shoulder, at the open field beyond the fence, as if he was already calculating what it might sell for per acre. Nathan, I said, very quietly. Look at me. He did, slowly. And what I saw in his face was not guilt, not exactly. It was something more like the expression of a man who has already made peace with a decision he knows was wrong, who has moved so far past the moment of choosing that he stopped being troubled by it. Mom, he said, I know this is hard, but the doctors have been concerned about you living out here alone. Your memory, there is nothing wrong with my memory. Dr. Simmons said, Dr. Simmons gave me a clean cognitive evaluation 18 months ago, and you have never met Dr. Simmons in your life. Nathan. My voice was steady. I was proud of that. Look me in the eyes and tell me you didn't forge those documents. He looked away first. Victoria stepped forward. She put her hand gently on Nathan's arm, a gesture that looked like support but functioned as control. She was positioning herself, I realized, as the reasonable one, the caring one, the daughter-in-law who was simply trying to help manage a difficult situation with a difficult mother. Evelyn, she said, her voice soft and practiced. We know this feels overwhelming. That's completely understandable. The transition to a care facility doesn't have to be traumatic. We've already selected a wonderful place, very comfortable, I'm not going to a care facility, I said. Mom, my name, I said, turning back to Nathan, is Mrs. Hartwell to that man and to anyone else who comes to this house with paperwork I didn't sign. And you... I stopped. I pulled in a breath. You should go. Nathan's expression shifted. Something colder moved beneath the surface of it. Mom, we're not trying to fight you. We're trying to... You have 72 hours, you said. I picked up my coffee cup from the porch railing. Then I have 72 hours. I suggest you use yours the same way I intend to use mine. Gerald closed his briefcase. Victoria's smile didn't waver, but something behind her eyes went very still. Nathan looked at me once more, and for just a moment, one single fraction of a second, I thought I saw something that might have been shame. Then he turned, walked down the porch steps, and got back into the silver SUV. I stood on that porch, and I watched them drive away down the gravel road until the car disappeared around the bend, and all that was left was the sound of Harold's rooster and the wind moving through the field and the weight of what I now understood clearly, completely, and without any remaining illusion. My son had tried to steal my home, and he had done it with a smile. What? I went inside. I sat down at the kitchen table where I had made biscuits for people I loved. I put my coffee cup down and I looked at my hands, the same hands that had held Nathan the night he was born, that had tied his shoes and signed his permission slips and pressed money into his palm when he was too proud to ask for it. And I made myself sit with the full reality of what had just happened. It would have been easier to cry, but I had work to do. I picked up the phone and called Margaret Caldwell. She answered on the second ring. Margaret was 68, sharp as a blade, and she had known me for 30 years. She had drawn up my husband's will, restructured the family trust twice, and once told a county judge to his face that his interpretation of an easement clause was embarrassing to the legal profession. She was the kind of woman who did not panic, which is precisely why I called her first. Evelyn, she said, you sound like someone just walked over your grave. Close enough, I said. Margaret, I need you to listen very carefully. I told her everything, the documents, the forged signature, the attorney with the briefcase, Nathan's face when I'd asked him to look at me, Victoria's careful, practiced calm. Margaret was quiet for a long moment after I finished. Do you still have your copy of the original property deed and the trust documentation? She asked. In the fireproof box in my bedroom closet, where they've been for 11 years. Good. Don't move them. Don't let anyone in that house. And Evelyn, yes? Don't underestimate what they're willing to do next, she said. If they went this far, they didn't do it alone. We need to find out who helped them. I told her I understood. I hung up the phone and sat for a moment in the quiet of my farmhouse kitchen, the house my grandfather's land had made possible, the house my husband had loved, the house I had lived in for 41 years. Then I stood up, walked to the sink, rinsed my coffee cup, and set it on the drying rack the way I did every single morning. Because that was my kitchen. And whatever Nathan believed he had set in motion, whatever papers he had signed with my name, whatever story he and Victoria had built to make me look like a confused old woman who could no longer be trusted with her own life, he was going to find out very soon that he had made the most expensive mistake of his. Margaret called me back at 7 the next morning before I'd even finished making coffee. I'd barely slept. I'd lain in my bed staring at the ceiling of the room I'd shared with Robert for 23 years, listening to the farmhouse settle around me the way old houses do, creaking and sighing, as if the building itself was processing the weight of what had happened. At some point around 3 in the morning, I'd gotten up, gone to the closet, opened the fireproof box, and spread all my documents across the kitchen table just to look at them. The deed, the trust papers, the investment accounts, everything in order, everything exactly where it was supposed to be. I sat with them until the sky outside started to lighten, and then I put them back, locked the box, and told myself to think clearly. Margaret's voice when she called was the voice she used when she was already several moves ahead of a problem. "I pulled everything I could find on that attorney," she said, before I could even say good morning. "Gerald Foss. He's licensed in Tennessee, been practicing about 12 years, mostly real estate. But here's what's interesting. In the last 3 years, he's handled 6 property transfers involving elderly homeowners, all of them contested after the fact. 2 of them died before they could pursue legal action. 1 of them settled out of court. The other 3, she paused, and I heard papers rustling, are still open. I set my coffee down. "He's done this before," I said. "He's done this before," Margaret confirmed. "And every single transaction went through the same title company, a place called Meridian Property Solutions, Nashville office. They specialize in quick acquisitions, which is a polite way of saying they buy properties at below market value from sellers who are either desperate or don't fully understand what they're signing, or who never signed anything at all." "Exactly." Another pause. "Evelyn, I need to ask you something directly. When Nathan first mentioned power of attorney a few months ago, did he send you actual documents?" "He sent an envelope. I read the documents and didn't sign them. I called him and told him so." "Did you keep the envelope? The original documents he sent?" I thought back. The envelope had been sitting on my kitchen counter for almost a week before I'd called him. After the call, I'd put it... Where had I put it? "My filing cabinet," I said slowly, "in the folder marked Nathan, correspondence." "Go get it," Margaret said. "Right now, while we're on the phone. I need to know if the document he sent matches the one that was allegedly signed." I went to my small office off the back hallway, the room that had been Robert's study and that I'd converted into a workspace after he died. The filing cabinet was old and slightly sticky in the summer months, but it had 4 drawers, and I knew exactly where everything was. I pulled the folder. Inside it was the envelope Nathan had mailed, a standard legal mailer, his return address printed neatly in the upper left corner, and the document inside. I read out the date at the top of the document. Margaret was quiet for a moment. "That's not the same document," she said. "What do you mean?" "The power of attorney filed with the county recorder's office, the one Gerald Foss used as his legal basis for the property transfer, is dated 6 weeks later than what you're holding, which means either Nathan sent you one document, then had a different one forged and filed, or the document you're holding was a decoy from the start, something to make you feel like you'd already refused, so you wouldn't be watching for the second one." I sat down in Robert's old desk chair. I don't know exactly what I'd expected. I'd known, from the moment I saw my signature on those papers, that something deliberate had been done. But there's a difference between knowing someone has done something wrong and understanding how carefully they planned it, how many steps ahead they'd thought, how many contingencies they'd built. Nathan hadn't made a desperate decision. He hadn't acted impulsively out of greed and hoped it would work out. He had constructed something, layer by layer, over months. "Margaret," I said. "Yes." "How long do you think this has been in the works?" She didn't answer right away, and that told me everything. "Based on the filing dates and what I'm seeing," she finally said, "I'd estimate they started planning this somewhere around the time of the wedding, or possibly just before." Which means it was never about the marriage," I said. "The wedding was a milestone, something they used to mark the beginning of this." I heard her exhale. "I think you need to be prepared for the possibility that the marriage itself was, at least in part, about access. Victoria's background, I'm running it now. She may have experience in real estate. She may have been the one who identified the opportunity." I thought about Victoria stepping out of that silver SUV, the silk blouse, The way her eyes had moved around my kitchen like she was pricing the square footage. I hadn't imagined it. I had seen it exactly for what it was, and I had talked myself out of trusting my own eyes. That was the thing about getting older that nobody warned you about. Not the body slowing down, not the quiet, not the loneliness. It was the way the people around you, even people who claimed to love you, slowly taught you not to trust your own perception. They called it concern. They called it worry. They said things like you seem confused and you forgot that already. And maybe you shouldn't be handling this yourself. And drop by drop, if you let them, they filled you with doubt about your own mind until the doubt was all you had left. Nathan had been doing it to me for months. I just hadn't let myself name it until now. What do I do? I said to Margaret. Specifically, what do I do right now? Right now, she said, you do not leave that house. You do not let anyone inside without my knowledge. You photograph every document in that fireproof box and email me the images. And you act, if Nathan or Victoria contact you, like you are exactly the confused old woman they believe you to be. Do not let them know you've spoken to me. Do not let them know you found the original documents. Can you do that? I've been performing for people my entire life, I said. I think I can manage it a little longer. Good. I heard her chair shift. I'm going to make some calls. There's a financial investigator I've worked with before, a man named Carl Deaton. He's good, and he's discreet, and if there's a larger network behind this, he'll find the edges of it. I'll reach out to him today. Margaret. Yes? I looked around Robert's old study. The shelves of books he'd never finished reading. The framed photograph of the two of us at Niagara Falls in 1989, young and laughing at something I could no longer remember. The window that looked out over the eastern field, where the morning light was coming in sideways and gold across the grass. Thank you, I said. Don't thank me yet, she said. Thank me when it's over. She hung up, and I sat in the silence of that room for a long moment, and then I picked up my phone and sent Nathan a text message. Honey, I've been thinking. I'm sorry I reacted badly yesterday. Can we talk soon? I think maybe you're right that I need some help. I put the phone down on the desk and looked at it. The response came in less than 4 minutes. Of course, Mom. So glad you're thinking clearly. We'll come by Saturday. Don't worry about anything. I stared at those words, don't worry about anything, and I felt something move through me that was colder and more clarifying than anger. It wasn't quite rage. It wasn't quite grief. It was the specific sensation of a woman who has finally, completely, stopped lying to herself. My son thought I was already beaten. He thought the hardest part was done. I was wrong about that in ways that were going to cost him more than he'd ever calculated. The next 48 hours were the strangest of my life, which is saying something for a 72-year-old woman who has buried a husband and survived a market crash, and once drove herself to the emergency room with 2 broken ribs because I didn't want to bother anyone. I photographed every document in my fireproof box and emailed them to Margaret. I also, on her instruction, had Dorothy from next door come over and witness me photographing them, so there was another person who could attest to what was in my possession and when. Dorothy was 74, sharp-eyed, and deeply suspicious of anyone who drove a vehicle that cost over $40,000, so she was delighted to help and asked very few questions. Whatever Nathan has done, she said, looking at the stack of papers on my kitchen table, I always thought there was something too careful about that boy, like he thought about things the way a person thinks about them when they plan to get away with something. I know, I said. You always knew, Dorothy said, not unkindly. You just loved him more than you trusted yourself. She wasn't wrong. Carl Deaton called me on a Friday afternoon. He had a voice like a man who'd spent a lot of years asking questions in rooms where people didn't want to answer them. Flat, unhurried, giving nothing away. He asked me to walk him through the timeline from the beginning, and he listened without interrupting for almost 20 minutes while I laid out everything I knew. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Mrs. Hartwell, he said, what you're describing, the forged documents, the title company, the attorney with the pattern of elderly clients, this isn't a one-time scheme. What you've stumbled into looks like the tail end of an operation that's been running for at least 4 years. Margaret mentioned other cases, I said. 3 that she found. I'm seeing closer to 9 once you expand the search radius and look at adjacent counties. Same structure every time. Identify an elderly homeowner, establish legal access through forged or manipulated documentation, Move the property quickly through a title company that doesn't ask questions, and use the proceeds to fund the next stage. It's a wheel. It keeps spinning as long as nobody stops it. Nathan and Victoria, I said. Where do they fit in that structure? Based on what I'm finding, they're not the architects. They're participants, recruited into the network, most likely through Victoria's prior real estate contacts. Your property was probably flagged as a target before they were even married. The marriage gave Nathan proximity and plausibility. A son with legitimate family concern is a much cleaner way to establish power of attorney than a stranger. I sat with that for a moment. She targeted him, I said. I don't know that for certain, Carl said. It's possible Nathan understood exactly what he was getting into. It's possible he was recruited by Victoria and chose to participate. It's possible he initiated the whole thing himself and brought her in. What I do know is that both of them benefited, and both of them took deliberate steps to execute the plan. The question of who had the idea first is less important, legally, than the question of what they each did. What do you need from me? Time, he said, and patience. If we move too quickly, we alert the network and the main players disappear. If we let this play out a little further, if you can maintain the appearance that you're cooperating, that you're confused, that you've accepted the situation, we give them enough rope to make mistakes they can't walk back. How much longer? 2, maybe 3 weeks. They'll want to finalize the sale quickly before any challenge can be filed. That urgency is going to make them sloppy. People in a hurry make errors. 2 to 3 weeks of pretending to be a woman who had already surrendered. 2 to 3 weeks of letting my son believe he had won. All right, I said. There's one more thing, Carl said. I need you to record any conversations that happen on your property. Tennessee is a one-party consent state, which means you can legally record any conversation you're a participant in. If Nathan or Victoria come to that house in the next few weeks, I need you to be recording. How? He walked me through the app. It was simple, simpler than I expected. A small icon on my phone screen. Press it before they arrived, slip the phone into my cardigan pocket, and let it run. I practiced it 3 times after we hung up. Nathan and Victoria arrived on Saturday at 11 in the morning, just like he'd texted. Victoria carried a fruit basket, which struck me as such a perfectly calculated gesture that I almost said something. A fruit basket was what you brought to a sick person, or to someone you were managing. It was an apology gift that didn't admit to anything. It said we're thoughtful while simultaneously saying you're the problem here. I thanked her for it warmly. I had pressed the record button before their car reached the end of the driveway. We sat in the living room. I had made tea. I wore my oldest cardigan, the beige one with the slightly frayed cuffs, because I wanted to look as much like the unthreatening elderly woman they'd decided I was as possible. I kept my movement slow. I let moments of silence sit a breath longer than necessary before I filled them. When Nathan said something, I nodded slightly before responding, as if I was processing. I gave them exactly the version of me they needed to see. Mom, Nathan started, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees in the posture of a man having a serious talk. I want you to know that everything we're doing is because we love you. This is hard for all of us. I know that, sweetheart, I said. The care facility we've chosen, and I want you to see it before you form any opinions. It's really nothing like what you might be imagining. It's beautiful. They have gardens, a reading room. The staff there are wonderful, and you'd have people around you, which is so much better than being out here alone. I have been a little lonely, I said, which was partially true. Victoria leaned in. She had perfected a particular expression, open, concerned, slightly sorrowful, that must have taken considerable practice. Evelyn, I want you to know that I think of you as family, she said. This was never about the house. This was always about making sure you're safe and cared for. A woman like you deserves to have people looking after her. A woman like you. I turned those words over quietly, in the privacy of my own mind, while my face held its soft, grateful expression. What kind of woman was I, in Victoria's assessment? Old, manageable, someone whose assets had value but whose opinions did not. Someone whose dignity could be packaged up and relocated to a room with a garden view and called care. I've been thinking about what you both said, I told them, and I think maybe you're right that I shouldn't be managing so much on my own. Nathan exhaled, and I watched the tension drop out of his shoulders. Victoria's smile widened just slightly. There it was, the relief of people who have gotten what they wanted. That means so much to us, Nathan said. I do have a few questions, I continued, keeping my voice gentle. About the paperwork. I get a little confused about the details, and I just want to make sure I understand what's happening with the house. Of course, Victoria said. We can walk you through anything. Well, I was looking at the documents that man brought, Gerald, was it? And I noticed the date on the power of attorney. I just can't seem to remember signing anything in July. My memory isn't what it was, I added, with a small apologetic smile. But July seems like I would think I'd remember something like that. A flicker. So brief I might have missed it if I hadn't been watching for it. Nathan's eyes moved to Victoria just for a fraction of a second before moving back to me. Mom, you did sign it, he said steadily. I was there. I know it can feel confusing when you don't remember something, but it happened. Were you there? I asked, as if genuinely trying to recall. I don't remember you being here in July. When did you come? Another flicker, longer this time. We sent someone, he said, a notary, to help you. Oh, I nodded slowly. A notary. I don't remember a notary coming to the house. But like I said, my memory... I trailed off with a little wave of my hand. Who was it? Maybe if I heard the name. Mom, it doesn't really matter who it was. I'd just like to know, I said pleasantly. For my own peace of mind. Was it someone local? I know most of the notaries in the county, being an older resident. There was a silence that stretched just one beat too long. Victoria touched Nathan's arm. Evelyn, she said smoothly, the important thing right now isn't the paperwork details. The important thing is making this transition as comfortable for you as possible. Why don't we talk about what you'd like to bring with you to Maplewood? The things that matter to you, your photographs, your personal items. I'd like to bring the house, I said. The pleasantness in my voice didn't shift. Not a single note of it changed. But I watched Victoria's expression freeze in a way that told me the words had landed exactly where I intended them to. Mom, I'm joking, I said, with a small laugh, shaking my head. Forgive me. You're right. Let's talk about Maplewood. Tell me everything about it. And we did. We sat for another 40 minutes and talked about Maplewood Gardens and the reading room and the staff and the activities calendar, and I asked questions and nodded and poured more tea, and Nathan grew more relaxed with each passing minute, and Victoria watched me with an expression that had settled back into warm professionalism, but had, at its edges, the careful watchfulness of a woman who wasn't entirely sure what she'd just heard. She was right to be watchful, but she was too late. Carl called me the following Tuesday. He'd been building a picture of Meridian Property Solutions. The title company, it turned out, was a shell within a shell. The principal listed on the incorporation documents was a man named Douglas Hale, 61 years old, with a background in commercial real estate development and a history of entities that dissolved quickly. LLC after LLC, each one lasting just long enough to move money before closing. The pattern, Carl explained, was called layering. It's what you do when you want to make money move in ways that are hard to follow. Hale is the architect, Carl said. He's been running some version of this scheme for close to a decade. He finds participants, people with access, family members of targets, people with real estate backgrounds who know how to move quickly, and he cuts them in for a percentage. Your son and his wife were likely offered somewhere between 20 and 30% of the sale value of your property in exchange for establishing the legal pathway. My property, Margaret had told me, had a fair market value of close to $1.4 million when you factored in the farmhouse, the acreage, and a small building on the eastern parcel that Robert had once used for equipment storage. 20% of $1.4 million. I thought about the Italy vacation Nathan had mentioned, the apartment in Nashville, the silver SUV. The federal authorities, I said. Is this something they'd be interested in? Already made contact, Carl said. I've been building this file for 4 years, Mrs. Hartwell. Your case is the piece I needed to tie the network together. 3 of the previous victims weren't able to provide the kind of documentation trail you have. You kept everything. And the original documents Nathan sent you, the decoy power of attorney, that's the key. It proves 2 different versions of the document existed, which is direct evidence of fabrication. What happens now? Now we let the sale process get as far as possible. We want as much activity on record as we can get. We want emails, phone calls, wire transfers, anything that shows the network in motion, And when we move on all of them simultaneously. Hale, Foss, Nathan, Victoria, anyone else with documented participation. How long? I asked. 2 weeks, maybe a little more. I know that's hard. I've waited longer for less important things, I said. After I hung up, I walked out to the front porch and stood in the October air, which had turned sharp and clear the way Tennessee October does. Cold enough to wake you up, bright enough to make everything look freshly washed. I could see the field stretching east from the fence line, yellow-brown now, with the end of the season, the old sycamore at the property boundary standing bare against the sky. Robert had planted that sycamore the year Nathan was born. He dug the hole himself in the hard clay soil, talking to me the whole time about how someday the boy would climb it, how they'd hang a tire swing from the lowest branch, how there was something right about a man planting a tree on the day his child came into the world. Nathan had never climbed it. He'd been more interested in video games, and then in grades, and then in cities, and then in money. The tree had grown anyway. Trees do that regardless of whether anyone is paying attention to them. I looked at it for a long time, and I didn't let myself think about the boy Nathan had been, because that boy wasn't the one who had sent a forged document to a notary and arranged to have my home stolen out from under me. Grief for the person someone used to be is a luxury, and I couldn't afford it right then. What I could afford was patience. What I had was time. And what Nathan and Victoria and Douglas Hale and Gerald Foss were about to discover was that a quiet woman living alone in an old farmhouse in Tennessee was not the same thing as a defeated one. Not by a distance they were even close to measuring. Victoria texted me on a Thursday, 11 days after their Saturday visit. The text was warm and detailed. She'd attached a PDF of the Maplewood Gardens brochure, a move-in checklist, and information about what size furniture would fit in the private room they'd reserved for me. She wrote that she knew the transition was emotional, but that she and Nathan were excited to have me closer and that they'd already spoken to the staff about my preferences. She had spoken to the staff about my preferences. She had reserved me a room. She had sent a move-in checklist. I read the text 3 times, and then I read it a 4th time, slowly, and I let the full shape of her certainty land on me. Victoria was not a woman who made contingency plans. She had not considered the possibility that this would not go exactly as she'd arranged it. In her mind, I was already at Maplewood Gardens, already sitting in the reading room, already reduced to a schedule and a set of personal items in boxes, and she was already living the life that my farmhouse's sale had funded. She had never once considered that the woman she'd written off as confused might be several moves ahead of her. I wrote back, "This all looks wonderful. Thank you so much for thinking of everything." I set the phone down. And then I called Margaret, and Margaret called Carl, and Carl confirmed that federal investigators had everything they needed to proceed. The date was set, 8 days. I went to bed that night, and for the first time in weeks, I slept. Not easily, and not without waking twice in the dark to listen to the house settle around me. But I slept because there is a particular kind of rest that comes when you have done everything in your power and the next move belongs to someone else. You stop rehearsing. You stop calculating. You simply wait. The way a person waits who knows that what they've built is solid, and that solid things, when the moment comes, do not fall. The farmhouse was quiet around me. The old sycamore stood in the dark beyond the window. Somewhere down the road, Harold's rooster was probably already convinced it was close enough to morning, and Nathan Hartwell, in his Nashville apartment, was sleeping without worry. He had no idea that the most expensive mistake of his life was now exactly 8 days away from becoming undeniable. The 8 days passed the way the last days of something always do. Slowly at first, then all at once. I kept to my routines. I made coffee in the morning. I tended the flower beds even though most things were dying back for the season, because there was something grounding about putting my hands in the cold soil and pulling dead stems away from the roots underneath. I drove into town twice for groceries. I waved to Harold across the fence. I answered Victoria's occasional texts with the warm, slightly vague responses of a woman who was cooperating fully and thinking about nothing more complicated than which photographs to pack. Inside, I was doing something else entirely. Carl had asked me to write down everything I remembered about the sequence of events going back to the wedding. Dates, conversations, specific phrases Nathan had used, anything that might constitute a documented pattern of behavior rather than a single incident. I spent 3 evenings at Robert's old desk doing exactly that, writing longhand in a yellow legal pad because I've always thought more clearly with a pen than a keyboard. filling pages with the kind of detail you only access when you force yourself to sit still and move backward through time without flinching. It was harder than I expected, not because the memories were unclear, they were painfully clear, but because writing it down meant acknowledging the full timeline, how early it had started, how gradually it had been constructed. Every small moment that I dismissed or explained away or forgiven because I loved him, and love, in my experience, has always been the most expensive thing a person can carry. I wrote about the first time Nathan had asked me, 2 years before the wedding, whether I'd ever thought about selling the farmland. I hadn't thought much of it at the time. He'd framed it as curiosity, as concern, as the natural question of a son who worried about his aging mother managing 43 acres alone. I'd said no, I wasn't interested in selling, and he'd dropped it, and I'd forgotten it within a week. Now I wrote it down and underlined it. I wrote about a dinner we'd had, about 18 months ago, where he'd brought up the idea of adding his name to my bank accounts. Just for convenience, he'd said, just so someone could help me manage things if I ever needed it. I deflected without being direct about it, the way I often deflected things with Nathan, because directness between us had always had a cost I wasn't sure I wanted to pay. He'd let it go. I'd let it go. We'd talked about something else. I underlined that too. There were 6 or 7 moments like that in the legal pad by the time I finished. 6 or 7 times over 2 years when Nathan had tested a door to see if it would open, and each time I'd kept it closed without quite realizing I was doing it. And each time he'd retreated and waited and come at it from a different angle, patient in the way of someone who has decided they're going to get somewhere eventually and is simply determining the best route. I gave the legal pad to Margaret when she came to the house on the 5th day. She read it in my kitchen over a cup of tea and didn't say anything until she'd finished. Then she looked up and said, "This is going to matter." "The whole thing?" I asked. "The pattern," she said. "Individual incidents can be explained away. A pattern can't. What you've documented here is a systematic, sustained effort to gain access to your assets over a period of at least 2 years. That's not a moment of greed. That's a campaign." She set the pad down on the table. "When the investigators sit down with Nathan, this is the kind of thing that changes what a prosecutor sees." I looked at the yellow legal pad with its pages of my own handwriting and thought about what it had cost to produce it. Not time, not effort, those were nothing. What it had cost was something harder to name: the sustained act of seeing your own child clearly, without the protective blur of love, written out in ink that didn't allow for revision. "I know it's hard," Margaret said, reading something in my expression that I hadn't intended to show. "It's necessary," I said. "Hard and necessary aren't the same thing." She gave me the look of a woman who has known me for 30 years and has learned not to push when I've closed something off. We talked for 2 more hours about the legal proceedings, about what to expect when things moved, about the proper protocols for evidence handling and witness statements. I took notes. I asked questions. I was systematic about it in a way that I think surprised even Margaret, who knew me well. The old woman who grew flowers and drove a pickup had apparently been replaced, at least in this room, by someone who intended to dismantle a fraud network with the same focused attention she'd once brought to managing a family business. Maybe they weren't so different after all. On the 6th day, Nathan called. Not a text, an actual call, which was unusual enough that I felt a small current of alertness move through me the moment I saw his name on the screen. I pressed record, let it run for a few seconds, then answered. "Hey, Mom." His voice was easy, practiced, the voice of a man who believed the situation was well under control. "Just checking in. How are you feeling about everything?" "A little nervous," I said, which was true, just not in the way he meant. "That's completely natural. Change is hard. But we're going to make sure it goes smoothly." "I know you will, sweetheart." A pause. Then, "We were thinking of coming out this weekend to help you start sorting things. Boxes for what you want to keep, you know. It might help to get started before the actual move date." "That sounds fine," I said. "Victoria knows a good donation service too, for anything you don't want to take with you. Furniture, equipment, that kind of thing. They can clear it fast." Clear it fast. I noted the phrase and kept my voice warm. "I'll make a list," I said. "Great." Another pause. "Mom, the documents for the property. The final transfer. There's one more signature they need from you, just a formality. Gerald will bring it when we come on Saturday. It'll take about 2 minutes. There it was. There was the piece they still needed, despite the forged power of attorney, despite the filed transfer. There was apparently one more document requiring my actual, in-person signature that Gerald had not been able to produce from thin air. Something in the chain of transfer that required the original owner's consent, perhaps a title requirement, or a final closing document that couldn't be replicated without me physically holding a pen. They needed me to sign my own house away. And because they believed I was a confused old woman who had already agreed to everything and was now peacefully packing her photographs into boxes, they thought Saturday was going to go without a problem. Of course, I said. I don't mind signing things. You know I trust you. I know, Mom. His voice softened, and for a moment, just a moment, it sounded like Nathan at 12 years old, the boy who used to fall asleep on the couch watching baseball with his father, the boy who had once cried in my arms for 20 minutes because a friend had said something cruel to him at school. I know. I let the silence sit between us for one breath. I'll see you Saturday, I said. I hung up and immediately called Carl. He answered before the second ring. When I told him what Nathan had said about the signature document, he was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. That's it, he said. That's the move we've been waiting for. They're going to try to get a legitimate signature to clean up the title chain. If you'd signed that document without knowing what it would have made the whole fraud significantly harder to untangle. Saturday, I said. Saturday, Carl confirmed. I'll contact the federal investigators today. This is the moment we've been building toward. When they show up, we want everything already in place. What does that mean, exactly? For Saturday morning? He told me. I listened carefully, and I asked a few specific questions, and when he finished, I said I understood and hung up. Then I sat in the living room for a few minutes doing nothing at all. No planning, no calculating, no rehearsing conversations. Just sitting in my farmhouse in the October afternoon light, which was coming through the west windows at that particular angle that turned the wooden floor the color of honey, and I let myself feel the full weight of what was coming. Not dread. Not quite. Something more complex. The particular sensation of a person standing at the edge of something irreversible, knowing that crossing it will change everything, knowing also that not crossing it would be its own kind of destruction. Whatever happened on Saturday, nothing was going to be the same afterward. That was what I had to accept before I could go any further. I accepted it sitting in that honey-colored afternoon light, in the house my grandfather's determination had made possible, in the chair where Robert used to read after dinner, with the sound of wind moving through the bare branches of the sycamore outside. I accepted it, and then I got up and went to the kitchen and started making dinner because I had 5 days left and I intended to eat properly. On the 7th day, something happened that I hadn't anticipated. Victoria came alone. No Nathan, no Gerald, no silver SUV in the driveway. Just Victoria's own car, a white sedan, pulling up at 2 in the afternoon on a day when I hadn't expected anyone. I saw her from the kitchen window and felt a spike of something that might have been fear before I identified it correctly as alertness. I pressed record on my phone and put it in my pocket before I opened the door. She was carrying a small gift bag. Candles, she explained when I let her in. She'd been at a boutique in Nashville and thought of me. That's very thoughtful, I said, and brought her into the living room. She sat across from me with the practiced composure of a woman who had prepared for this conversation, and for a few minutes we talked about nothing. The fall weather, a recipe she'd been meaning to try, a book she'd seen mentioned somewhere. I waited. Victoria didn't make social visits for no reason. Evelyn, she said eventually, setting down her teacup, I wanted to come and talk to you without Nathan. Sometimes these conversations are easier without… You know how men are. They don't read the emotional side of things. They don't, I agreed pleasantly. I want you to know that I understand this is painful for you. Leaving a home you've lived in for 40 years, that's a loss. It's a real loss, and I don't want you to feel like that's not being honored. Thank you, Victoria. I also want you to know… She paused, tilting her head slightly in the way of a woman choosing words with care, that Nathan has a lot of complicated feelings about all of this too. He loves you. I know you might not feel that right now, but he does, in his way. He's always struggled with how to show it. I looked at her. He has struggled with that, I said. And I think deep down he knows that some of the choices he's made haven't been… She stopped again. She was performing transparency, I realized. She was performing the role of the honest, reflective daughter-in-law who was brave enough to have the difficult conversation, and she was doing it smoothly enough that if I hadn't already known what she was, I might have found it moving. He knows, she continued, that things could have been handled more gently. He wanted me to tell you that he's sorry for how abrupt it's all felt. An apology, I said. Tell me, is that what this is? In a way. She met my eyes, and for a moment, just one, her composure had a seam in it. Not wide enough to see through clearly, but there. A line of tension beneath the smoothness. I suppose I'm here because I wanted to understand where you're at emotionally, before Saturday, just to make sure that we're all on the same page. Just to make sure. She had come to verify, I realized. Nathan had sent her to check that I was still the cooperative, confused old woman they needed me to be on Saturday morning. She was here to take my temperature, to look into my eyes and assess whether there was anything in them that should worry her. I gave her nothing. I gave her the soft, slightly tired, mildly emotional response of a woman who was genuinely touched by this visit and relieved to feel understood. I even let my eyes water slightly, which wasn't entirely manufactured. The situation warranted it, just not for the reasons Victoria assumed. It means so much to me that you came, I told her. I've been feeling very alone in all of this. She reached across and patted my hand. You're not alone, she said warmly. The phone in my cardigan pocket was recording every word. She left 40 minutes later, with her gift bag emptied and her tea finished, and, I was certain, a report ready to deliver to Nathan that everything was proceeding as planned. She walked to her car with the unhurried step of a woman whose arrangements were solid. I stood on the porch and watched her go, and I thought about what Dorothy had said to me 10 days ago over the spread of documents on my kitchen table. You always knew. You just loved him more than you trusted yourself. I thought about that. I thought about how much of my life I'd spent adjusting my own perception to protect other people's image of themselves. How many times I'd seen something clearly and then quietly filed it away under, I must be wrong, or I'm being too sensitive, or simply I love him. And love means giving the benefit of the doubt. I had given Nathan Hartwell every benefit of every doubt for 50 years. And here was what it had cost me. The thought didn't make me angry, not in the hot, immediate way. It made me very still. The way a person gets still when they've arrived at a truth they're going to have to carry for the rest of their life, and they've decided they'd rather carry it with open eyes than with the comfortable blindfold of self-deception. I went back inside. I called Carl and told him about Victoria's visit. Good, he said, and I could hear something like satisfaction in his voice. That tells us they're nervous. People don't send scouts unless they're uncertain. They're not as confident as they're pretending. She's good at pretending, I said. So are you, he said. One day left. Friday moved like water. I cleaned the house. Not frantically, carefully. The way I always cleaned when something important was coming, because there's a particular dignity in having a clean house when the world is about to be loud and chaotic inside it. I washed the kitchen floor on my hands and knees the way my mother had taught me, because I've always thought mops leave too much dirt in the corners. I dusted the photograph frames in the hallway. I polished the kitchen table. I went to the fireproof box one final time and removed 3 specific documents, which I placed in a separate folder and set on the kitchen counter where they would be visible. This was Carl's instruction. Part of the arrangement for Saturday morning. I called Dorothy at 7 in the evening. Tomorrow, I said. I'll be right here, she said. You need anything, you call, even if it's the middle of something. Thank you. Stop thanking me and get some sleep, she said, in the tone of a woman who was not going to take no for an answer. I tried. I lay in the bed that had been mine and Robert's and looked at the ceiling and didn't sleep for a long time. I thought about a lot of things. I thought about Robert, because it would have been stranger not to. This was his land, his house, the investment he'd quietly grown over 20 years that Nathan had evidently heard enough about to covet. I thought about what Robert would have done in my position. I thought he probably would have confronted Nathan directly, early, in the forthright way of a man who believed that honesty was still the most efficient tool in almost any situation. He might have been right. He also might have found, as I had, that there are people for whom honesty provides no leverage because they've already decided that the truth is less important than the outcome they want. I thought about the morning Nathan was born. The hospital in Clarksburg, the blue room, the particular quality of 4 a.m., that hour when everything feels both very fragile and very real. Robert had held the baby and looked at me over the top of that small blanketed head and said something that I'd kept in a private place for 50 years and wasn't going to repeat even now, because some things belong to the person who said them and the person who received them and no one else. I thought about the boy Nathan had been. I let myself do it finally, because I'd been keeping it at arm's length for weeks, and carrying that kind of weight uses energy you need elsewhere. I let myself think about the boy at 12, the boy at 16, the boy at 23 who had called me crying from his first apartment in Memphis because he didn't know how to be alone yet and wasn't sure he was doing any of this right. I had driven 4 hours to bring him home-cooked food and sat with him for a weekend and told him that not knowing how to do things yet was different from not being able to do them, and that the difference mattered. I had raised him the best I knew how. I had also, somewhere along the way, raised someone capable of forging his mother's signature on a legal document and arranging to have her relocated to a care facility so he could liquidate her assets. Both things were true simultaneously. That was the part nobody tells you about raising children. You don't just raise the person you intend to raise. You raise everything, the good and the soft, and the failed and the broken. And sometimes the parts you didn't mean to cultivate are the parts that grow strongest. At some point I slept, dreamlessly, which felt right. Saturday morning. I woke at 5:30 before the alarm, as I always do when something significant is on the other side of the morning. I made coffee. I stood at the kitchen window and watched the eastern field come up out of the dark, the slow gray lifting, then a thin line of orange at the horizon, then the light coming in full and cold and clean across the dry grass. I showered, I dressed, I put on the dark green cardigan, not the old beige one. This was not a morning for performing confusion and frailty. I combed my hair. I ate toast at the kitchen table. At 8:45, Carl called. "We're in position," he said. His voice was level and calm. "There are 4 investigators and 2 federal agents. 2 are stationed on the county road. 2 will be in the barn, which gives them sight lines to the house and the driveway. The federal agents will be inside, but they'll arrive before Nathan and Victoria." "What time?" 9:15. Nathan said 11, which gives us almost 2 hours of setup. By the time they pull up, everything is in place. "And me?" "You answer the door. You let them in. You sit down with them, and you let them believe it's proceeding normally. When the moment comes, you don't need to do anything. It will be handled." Carl. "Yes?" "When you say the moment comes, what does that look like exactly? I want to know what I'm going to see." He told me, specifically and clearly, the way he always did. I appreciated that about him. He never softened things to protect me from them. He told me what was going to happen and trusted me to handle it, which is the most respectful thing one person can do for another. When he finished, I said thank you and hung up. At 9:12, I heard a car in the driveway. I looked out the front window and saw a dark blue sedan, government plates. 2 people stepped out. A woman in her late 40s with close-cropped hair and a quality of contained authority about her that I recognized immediately, and a man somewhat younger carrying a bag. I opened the door before they reached the porch. "Mrs. Hartwell," the woman said. "I'm Special Agent Patricia Downs. This is Agent Reyes. We spoke with Margaret Caldwell last week." "You did," I said. "Come in." They came inside. Agent Downs moved through the living room with a quick, professional eye, assessing the space without making it obvious. Agent Reyes set up something electronic near the kitchen doorway. I didn't ask the technical details, but Carl had told me what it was for. Reyes was efficient and quiet, and he was finished in under 10 minutes. "You have the folder on the counter?" Downs asked. "Where Carl instructed," I confirmed. She looked at me in the way of someone recalibrating a prior assumption. "You're very calm," she said. "I've had 2 weeks to prepare," I said. "And I've been waiting for this for longer than that, I think, even when I didn't know it." She nodded slowly. "When they arrive, you behave naturally. Talk to them the way you have been. Don't try to move the conversation in any direction. Let them lead. We need them to produce the document and attempt to obtain the signature." "I understand." "If at any point you feel unsafe," "I won't," I said. "They're not going to hurt me. I was never the kind of woman they thought it was necessary to physically overpower. They thought they could manage me with paperwork and patience and the assumption that I was too old and too trusting to fight back. I looked at her steadily. They were wrong about all three. Agent Downs held my gaze for a moment. "Mrs. Hartwell," she said, "I've been doing this for 19 years. I've worked with a lot of victims in situations like yours." She paused. "I want you to know that what you built here, the documentation, the recorded conversations, the original documents, most people in your position don't have the presence of mind to put this together. What you did matters beyond this case." I didn't know exactly what to say to that, so I said thank you, and I meant it. She and Reyes positioned themselves in the back hallway, where they were not visible from the living room but could hear everything clearly. Carl's 2 investigators, I knew, were already in the barn. The 2 on the county road would follow Nathan and Victoria's vehicle and position themselves at the end of the driveway on approach. I sat down in the living room. I put my phone in my cardigan pocket and started the recording. And I waited. They arrived at 11:03. I watched the silver SUV come down the gravel drive from the front window. Nathan driving, Victoria in the passenger seat, and in the back, Gerald Foss with his leather briefcase. 3 of them. Coming to a house they believed was already theirs, to collect the last signature from a woman they believed had already been. I let them knock. I counted 3 full seconds. Then I went to the door. Nathan looked relaxed in the way of someone who has told himself the hard part is behind him. He was dressed casually, weekend clothes, the clothes of a man with no particular agenda on a Saturday morning. He smiled when I opened the door, and the smile had more warmth in it than I'd seen in months, because he had stopped performing concern now and was simply allowing himself to feel the pleasure of a thing almost finished. "Morning, Mom," he said. "Good morning," I said. "Come in." Victoria came in with her expression of practiced warmth, smelling of something expensive and faintly floral. Gerald Foss nodded at me in the professionally neutral way of a man who preferred to be acknowledged as little as possible in these situations. I brought them into the living room and offered coffee, which Nathan declined and Victoria accepted. I went to the kitchen to get it, which gave me 30 seconds out of their sightlines and also brought me past the folder on the counter, the one containing my original documents. I brought Victoria her coffee and sat down across from them. We talked for perhaps 7 minutes about nothing significant. Nathan asked about the packing, whether I'd made progress. I said I'd sorted through some things in the bedroom. He said that was great, that was a good start. Victoria asked whether I'd looked at the Maplewood menu. Apparently they had a quite good Friday lunch. And then Gerald Foss set his briefcase on the coffee table and unclicked the latches. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said, pulling out a document and placing it on the table in front of me. "This is the final piece of the property transfer. It's a release of residency claim. Just confirms that you're vacating voluntarily and releasing any remaining interest in the property. Standard procedure for this kind of transition." Standard procedure. I looked at the document. I made the face of a woman reading something carefully, with the slightly furrowed brow and the slow movement of the eyes down the page that indicated careful attention. I turned one page, then another. "Where do I sign?" I asked. Gerald leaned forward and pointed to the signature line at the bottom of the 3rd page. I looked at it for a moment. Then I looked up from the document, and I looked at Nathan. Not at Gerald, not at Victoria, just at Nathan. At my son, who was sitting forward slightly in his chair with his hands loosely clasped between his knees, watching me with that carefully managed expression that had replaced his real face sometime in the last 2 years. "Nathan," I said. "Yeah, Mom?" "Before I sign this, there's something I'd like to show you." I stood up. I went to the kitchen and retrieved the folder from the counter. I came back and placed it on the coffee table next to Gerald's document. "What's this?" Nathan asked. "The original power of attorney you mailed me," I said. "The one I never signed. And next to it, the version Gerald filed with the county recorder's office, dated 6 weeks later, with my signature." I opened the folder and set both documents side by side where everyone in the room could see them. They're different documents, different dates, different signature witnesses listed, and one of them was never signed by me at all. The room changed. It changed the way a room changes when the temperature drops suddenly. Not visible, but undeniable. Felt in the chest. Gerald Foss started to speak. "Mrs. Hartwell, I understand this is confusing, But the legal documentation is Gerald. Agent Patricia Downs walked out from the back hallway. Her identification was already open in her hand. Gerald Foss. I'm Special Agent Downs, Federal Financial Crimes. I need you to step away from the briefcase. Gerald went the color of old chalk. Nathan stood up so quickly that his knee caught the edge of the coffee table, and Gerald's document slid to the floor. What is... he started. Nathan Hartwell. Agent Reyes came around the other side, calm and unhurried. We have a warrant for your arrest in connection with a federal investigation into property fraud, elder financial exploitation, and criminal conspiracy. Please keep your hands where I can see them. Victoria made a sound that I didn't have a name for. Something between a word and an exhalation. The specific sound, I thought, of a plan collapsing. Nathan looked at me. He looked at me the way a person looks at someone when they are trying to understand in real time how a situation they believed they had completely controlled managed to reverse itself entirely. His face moved through several expressions in the space of a few seconds: shock, calculation, something that might have been anger, before it arrived at something rawer and harder to classify. Mom, he said. His voice had lost all its practiced quality. It was just his voice. Mom, don't, I said. Not harshly, not with heat. I said it the way you say something when there is simply nothing more to add, when the word that's been sitting in you for weeks has finally found the right moment to step out into the air. Don't, I said again, quietly. Agent Reyes guided Nathan toward the door. Gerald Foss was being walked out the other side, his briefcase left behind on my coffee table. Victoria sat very still on the couch for a moment, and then she stood with the deliberate composure of a woman who had decided that if this was happening, she was going to face it upright. She didn't look at me as she walked out. Nathan did. At the door, before Agent Reyes moved him through it, he turned back, just once. And in his face, in that last unguarded moment before the door closed between us, I saw something that was almost grief. Not remorse exactly. I don't know that Nathan was capable of remorse in its fullest sense. Not yet, maybe not ever. But something adjacent to it. The face of a person who has arrived at a consequence and found it larger than they estimated. I held his gaze. I did not look away, and I did not soften, and I did not give him anything to hold on to. The door closed. I stood in my living room in the morning light, in the house that was still mine, surrounded by the quiet that comes after a loud thing has finished. Outside, I heard car doors. Voices, low and professional. The crunch of tires on gravel. Then, from somewhere down the road, Harold's rooster. Because that bird had no understanding of the weight of moments and sounded exactly the same as he always did. I sat back down in my chair. My hands were steady. I hadn't expected them to be, but they were steady and resting on my knees in the silence of my own house on a Saturday morning in October, and I breathed in the smell of the place I had been trying to save, and I let myself understand that I had saved it. It wasn't triumphant. That's what I want you to know. It wasn't the way triumph feels in stories, where everything swells and clarifies. It was quieter than that, more complicated. More like the feeling of putting down something heavy that you've carried so long you'd started to forget it had weight. I sat there for a long time. And then Agent Downs came back inside and sat across from me and said, there were things we needed to go through, statements and documentation and next steps. And I said yes, of course, and I was ready. I had been ready for longer than any of them knew. The statements took 4 hours. Agent Downs sat across from me at my kitchen table with a recording device between us and a legal pad at her elbow, and she walked me through everything from the beginning, not the beginning I'd been telling myself, the one that started with the silver SUV in the driveway, but the real beginning, the one that started 2 years earlier with a casual question about selling the farmland from a son who had apparently already decided how this was going to end. I told her about the dinner where Nathan had suggested adding his name to my bank accounts, about the envelope with the decoy power of attorney, about Victoria's reconnaissance visit the week before the arrest, when she'd brought candles and performed transparency and sat in my living room assessing whether I was still safely confused. I told her about the recorded conversations, the Saturday visit, the Sunday phone call, and handed over my phone so the recordings could be downloaded and cataloged. Downs listened to all of it with the focused, unreadable attention of someone who had spent 19 years separating what mattered from what didn't. She asked questions that were precise and occasionally surprising. Not the questions I expected, but the questions that filled in specific gaps in the legal structure of the case. When I finished, she made several notes on her legal pad and then looked up. "Mrs. Hartwell," she said, "I want to be direct with you about what comes next, because people in your position often have expectations that don't match the reality of how federal prosecution works." "Please," I said, "this is not going to be fast. A case this size, 9 properties, multiple defendants, a layered financial network. The investigation alone will take months. Trial preparation will take longer. You should expect to give depositions, to appear as a witness, possibly multiple times. There will be periods where it feels like nothing is happening, and then periods where everything happens at once. It's not a clean process." "Nothing about this has been clean," I said. "No." She almost smiled. "But what you built here is solid. The original documents, the recordings, the timeline you wrote out for your attorney, that's a foundation. Most of the victims in this network didn't have that. Some of them didn't realize what had happened until it was already too late to document it. You protected yourself while it was happening. That's—" She paused, and I saw her choosing the word deliberately. "That's rare." I appreciated that she said it plainly, without the particular brand of overwarmth that people sometimes bring to conversations with elderly women. The slightly raised voice, the simplified language, the implied assumption that you need to be handled with special gentleness because your age has made you fragile. She talked to me the way she would have talked to anyone she respected, and that mattered to me more than she probably realized. Agent Reyes brought in Gerald Foss's briefcase, which had been left on my coffee table when everything unfolded. He placed it on the kitchen counter and photographed it, then opened it and documented the contents with Margaret present as my legal representative. She had arrived 20 minutes after the arrests, having been on standby nearby, and was now moving through my house with the efficient authority of a woman who had been waiting for exactly this kind of morning. The briefcase contained the unsigned release document, 3 additional property files that did not belong to me, other names, other addresses, other people's lives reduced to paperwork and folder tabs, and a small separate envelope with a handwritten note inside that Downs photographed and said nothing about to me directly, though I saw her expression when she read it. I didn't ask. I had learned, in the weeks prior, that there were pieces of this I needed to let the professionals handle without trying to see everything at once. Dorothy came over at 1 in the afternoon with a casserole dish covered in aluminum foil, which she set on the counter without asking, and then positioned herself in the corner of the kitchen in a way that made clear she was staying until she decided it was appropriate to leave. No one told her to go. Downs glanced at her once and seemed to calculate, in the way of a person who is good at reading rooms, that Dorothy was not a complication. By 3 o'clock, the federal agents were done with the preliminary documentation and had left. Carl Deaton arrived shortly after, accompanied by a young woman who was, he explained, a financial analyst who had been building the forensic accounting side of the case. They sat at my kitchen table for another hour and a half, going through the specifics of the trust documentation and the investment accounts, and explaining to me, in terms I could follow, exactly what Douglas Hale's network had been attempting to access. The trust alone, Carl explained, would have been unreachable to them directly. It was structured in a way that required multiple layers of legal override to access, which was why they'd focused on the farmhouse as the initial target. The plan, as best he could reconstruct it, was to use the property sale as seed money for the next stage, establishing Nathan as my legal conservator, which would have required demonstrating cognitive decline, which was what the story about doctors and memory had been building toward. From conservatorship, they would have had access to everything. They were patient, Carl said. This wasn't a smash and grab. This was a multi-stage acquisition plan. How long before they would have had everything? I asked. If you'd cooperated, if you'd moved to Maplewood, accepted Nathan's conservatorship, stopped managing your own affairs, I'd estimate 18 months before the trust was accessible. Maybe 2 years? 18 months. 2 years. Not much time, measured against a lifetime. Plenty of time, measured against what they'd been willing to do. I sat with that number for a moment and then let it go, because sitting with numbers like that too long is a way of making yourself smaller, and I had other things to do. Nathan called from a holding facility that evening. It was a single permitted call, and he used it on me. Margaret had told me he might, and had advised me that I was under no legal obligation to accept it or respond to anything he said, and that anything he said could be relevant to the case. I accepted the call. There was a pause after the connection clicked through, and then his voice, flatter than I'd ever heard it, with the particular texture of someone who has spent several hours sitting in a room they can't leave. Mom. Nathan. I need you to... He stopped, started again. There's a lawyer. They said I can have a public defender, but if you could... I won't be paying for your defense, I said. Not with anger, just with the clarity of a decision I'd made 3 hours earlier and hadn't wavered from since. That's not something I'm able to do. Silence. Mom, I made a mistake. Nathan. I was standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the field in the last gray light of the October afternoon. I need you to understand something, and I need you to hear it clearly, so I'm going to say it once. What happened here was not a mistake. A mistake is forgetting someone's birthday. A mistake is taking a wrong turn. What you built, the forged documents, the fake notary, the decoy power of attorney, the story about my memory, that was planned, over months, with other people's help. That is not a mistake. His breath on the line was audible, unsteady. I know, he said. His voice cracked slightly on the word, in a way that sounded genuine, though I'd stopped trusting my ability to distinguish his genuine sounds from his performed ones. I know it wasn't a mistake. I know what I did. Mom, I don't know how to... He stopped again. I waited. I'm sorry, he said. And then quietly, so quietly I almost didn't catch it. I don't know if that means anything. The honest answer was that I didn't know either. The grief was there. I want to be clear about that because I think people expect a story like this one to end with a woman who has been so badly wronged that she feels nothing complicated, only righteous anger, only the clean satisfaction of justice. But that's not what I felt in that moment. What I felt was the particular sorrow of a person who has been forced to see something she spent years refusing to look at directly. The full shape of who her child had become, held up in the light, without the distortions of love or hope or willful blindness. I loved Nathan. I loved him the way you love someone you raised from nothing, someone whose first breath you witnessed, someone whose scraped knees you cleaned and whose nightmares you sat with in the dark. That kind of love doesn't have an off switch. It doesn't evaporate in the face of betrayal. It just transforms. It becomes something that coexists with the truth rather than replacing it. I loved my son, and my son had tried to steal my home and my life and my future. And both of those things were true at the same time, and I was going to have to learn how to carry both for as long as I lived. It means something, I told him. I don't know what yet, but it means something. I heard him exhale. The lawyer will contact you through proper channels, I said. I won't be involved in your legal defense. I hope you understand why. I do. Okay. Mom, get some rest, I said. That's all I have right now. I hung up. I stood at the window for a long time after that. Dorothy had finally gone home an hour before, after making me promise to eat something from the casserole before I went to bed. Margaret had called with a brief update. Arraignment was scheduled for Monday, bail hearing Tuesday, and I should expect a call from the prosecutor's office within the week. Carl had sent a text saying the financial analyst had found something significant in Hale's records and would follow up in the morning. The world was moving in the way worlds do after large things shift. Practical, procedural, relentless in its forward motion. I ate some of Dorothy's casserole. It was chicken and rice, and it was good, and I ate standing at the counter because I didn't feel like sitting down at the table alone. Then I washed the dish and went to bed. The weeks that followed were nothing like the movies. In the movies, and I have watched enough of them in my 72 years to have formed opinions, justice arrives in a single dramatic moment. The gavel falls, the villain is led away, the music swells, and the protagonist stands in the sunlight with a sense of completion. In reality, justice is administrative. It is phone calls with prosecutors and emails from Carl's analyst and depositions scheduled and rescheduled, and a court date that got pushed back 6 weeks because one of the defense attorneys filed a motion that required a response. It is Margaret calling to explain legal mechanisms I'd never needed to understand before, and me taking notes on a yellow legal pad, and my handwriting getting a little tired by the 3rd page. It is also, and this part I hadn't anticipated, the slow and complicated work of understanding what had happened to the other people. Carl had identified 9 properties connected to Hale's network. When the full scope of the operation became clear, to me, to the federal investigators, to the local news media that picked up the story in fragments over the following weeks, there were names and faces attached to those 9 properties. Real people. Older, most of them. A retired school teacher in a neighboring county who had lost her home of 37 years and was living with her daughter because she had nowhere else to go. A widower in his late 70s whose small commercial property had been transferred out from under him while he was recovering from surgery and hadn't been fully coherent for weeks. A woman named Ruth, 81 years old, who had signed documents that she was later told she had signed voluntarily, though she had no memory of doing so. I read their stories in the case summary documents Carl sent me with their permission, and I felt something that I didn't have a precise word for. It wasn't pity. That word is too condescending for what I felt. It was more like recognition. The particular recognition of someone who almost became what they became. Who could have been one of those stories but wasn't, and has to figure out what to do with that accident of circumstance. Margaret called me one morning in mid-November and said, the prosecutor's office wanted to know if I would be willing to speak with some of the other victims. Not in any official capacity, just as, she paused, choosing words carefully, a person who went through the same thing and came out the other side with their situation intact. I said yes before she finished the sentence. The first call was with a man named Franklin, 78, from a small town about 40 miles east of Clarksburg. He'd lost a commercial property that he'd built himself over 40 years. A small hardware store that his father had started and he'd continued. The kind of business that is less a business and more a relationship with a community stretched out over generations. He'd been told he had signed a sale agreement during a period of illness. He hadn't remembered signing. He'd been dismissed, as I had almost been dismissed, as confused, as old, as someone whose perception of events was less reliable than the documents bearing his signature. Franklin was not a dramatic man. He spoke slowly and specifically and without self-pity, which I respected enormously. He told me what had happened in the flat, factual tone of someone who has processed a shock into something he can handle by removing its emotional charge. They made me feel like I didn't know my own mind, he said. That's the part that stays with me. Not even the property. It's when someone convinces you that you can't trust yourself, that's a particular kind of damage. I know, I said. You fought back, he said. My attorney told me, said you built the whole case. I had help. But you knew something was wrong. How did you... He stopped. I knew something was wrong too. I just didn't trust it. I let them talk me out of it. They're very good at that, I said. They practice it. They know exactly what to say to make an older person feel like their own certainty is the problem. Yeah. A pause. Yeah, that's exactly it. We talked for almost an hour. By the end of it, Franklin had spoken with Carl and agreed to connect with the legal team, and his case was added to the formal documentation in a way that strengthened the overall picture. He thanked me before he hung up, and I said there was no need for thanks, that I'd needed the conversation as much as he had, which was true. I called Ruth the following week. Ruth was 81 and had a dry, precise way of speaking that reminded me of Margaret. She had lost her late husband's family home, a property she'd lived in for over 50 years. She'd been living in a rental apartment for 8 months when we spoke, and she was angry in the specific way of a woman who has decided that anger is more useful to her than grief. I want to testify, she told me, in the 4th minute of our conversation. I want to sit in a courtroom and tell exactly what happened. I don't care how long it takes. I'll make sure Carl knows that, I said. Tell him I take notes, she said. I've been keeping a journal since it happened. Everything. Dates, times, what people said. My daughter told me I was obsessing. I told her I was documenting. I almost laughed. I kept a journal too, I said. Of course you did, Ruth said, as if this was the only reasonable response to this situation. What else were you going to do? Douglas Hale was arrested in the 3rd week of November. Carl told me by phone at 7 in the morning in the same level voice he'd used for every significant development. Hale had been picked up at his home in Nashville, a large house in a good neighborhood, the kind of address that speaks to years of successful operation. He had apparently been in the process of establishing the next stage of the scheme, 2 new targets identified, groundwork already being laid. when the federal investigation reached him. He was 61 years old. He had done this, in various forms, for close to a decade. The financial analysis estimated that the total assets moved through his network over that period were somewhere north of $12 million. $12 million extracted from people who had spent their entire lives building something, in the slow, unglamorous way of ordinary people who work and save and endure, only to have it taken from them by someone who had decided that their age made them a viable target, someone who had looked at the accumulated effort of other people's whole lives and seen nothing but an opportunity. I asked Carl, when he told me about the arrest, whether Hale had said anything. He asked for his attorney, Carl said. That was all. No remorse. People like Hale don't tend toward remorse, Carl said. They tend toward calculation. Right now he's calculating what he can offer in exchange for reduced charges and who he can give up to get it. Will that work? It might reduce his sentence. It won't eliminate it. The evidence is comprehensive. I sat with that. $12 million. A decade. Dozens of people's lives quietly dismantled by someone who had made a business of targeting the vulnerable. Carl, I said, in your professional opinion, what would have happened if I hadn't kept the original documents? If I hadn't found Margaret immediately? He was quiet for a moment. Honestly, you'd probably be at Maplewood Gardens right now. Nathan would have conservatorship. The trust would have been in the process of being liquidated, and Douglas Hale would be identifying his next target. I let that settle. All right, I said. All right, he agreed. The arraignment was on a Monday. I didn't attend. Margaret advised against it, on the grounds that my presence would generate exactly the kind of media attention that I'd rather control the timing of, and I agreed. But she called me immediately after and told me what had happened in that room. Nathan had pleaded not guilty. I'd expected that. It's what attorneys advise in the initial stage. It's procedural. It preserves options. It means nothing in terms of what ultimately happens. But I stayed with the words for a moment regardless. Not guilty. The formal assertion by my son, in a court of law, that he had not done what I knew with absolute certainty he had done. I thought about the forged signature, the decoy document, the Saturday in my living room when he had told me that I had signed papers I never signed, had looked me in the eyes and said it, calm and steady. Not guilty. Margaret must have heard something in my silence because she said, Evelyn, this is procedure. It doesn't mean anything. I know, I said. It doesn't make it easier to hear. No, she said. It doesn't. Gerald Foss entered a not guilty plea as well. Victoria, through her attorney, indicated she would be pursuing a separate defense strategy, which Carl told me later meant she was preparing to argue that she had been a peripheral participant who acted under Nathan's direction and had not been fully aware of the scope of what was happening. Is that credible? I asked. Not very, he said. We have her on 2 recordings. One of them has her describing to Nathan the timeline for the conservatorship stage. She used the phrase, once the old woman is settled in. We have that phrase on audio. I didn't say anything. Once the old woman is settled in, that phrase, clean and businesslike, referring to the process of removing me from my home and my life and my future. Spoken in the apartment I had never visited, by the woman who had sat in my living room and patted my hand and told me I was not alone. Good, I said finally. My voice was steady. Use it. Thanksgiving came and went in a quieter way than any in recent memory. Dorothy came over and brought sweet potato casserole and her grandson, who was 12 and extremely interested in my old pickup truck, and spent most of the afternoon asking me questions about it that I answered in honest detail. Margaret came for an hour in the afternoon, drank 1 glass of wine, and told me that the case was progressing well and that the prosecutor's office was expressing confidence. I cooked a turkey. Not a large one, just the 2 of us plus Dorothy's grandson, plus Harold from next door who had nowhere else to be and whom I'd always liked despite, or possibly because of, the rooster. It was an ordinary meal in the way that ordinary meals are not ordinary at all, when you consider what they require: a house to cook in, a table to gather around, the particular warmth of people who choose each other rather than people who are simply obligated to one another. I had worked very hard for that meal. I intended to eat every bite of it. There was a moment, after dinner, when Dorothy's grandson went out to look at the truck again, and Harold fell asleep in the living room chair, and Dorothy and I sat at the kitchen table with our second cups of coffee that Dorothy said to me quietly and without preamble, "How are you actually doing?" I thought about it. "I have bad days," I said. "Days where I drive into town and I see something, a family in a restaurant, a mother and son having coffee. And I feel it. The loss of what I thought I had. Not the house, the relationship, the idea of the relationship." "That's a real loss," Dorothy said. "Don't minimize it." "I'm not." I looked at my coffee cup. "But I also have days where I wake up in the morning in this house that is still mine and I think, I built this. Not just the documents, not just the case. My whole life, everything I did to protect it, and nobody took it from me. Not in the end." Dorothy was quiet for a moment. "No," she said. "They didn't. I think..." I stopped. Tried again. "I think there was a version of this where I wasn't paying attention, where I let Nathan handle more and more over the years because it was easier, because I was tired, because I thought trust meant not watching. And that version of this story ends very differently." "But you were paying attention." "I was paying attention," I said. "Even when I told myself I wasn't, even when I was making biscuits and pretending everything was fine, some part of me was paying attention." Dorothy raised her coffee cup in a small, unceremonious gesture. "To paying attention," she said. I raised mine. We drank our coffee in the quiet kitchen of my farmhouse, and outside the window. The bare branches of Robert's sycamore moved in the November wind, and Harold snored gently in the living room, and somewhere down the road, faithful and absolutely wrong about the time, a rooster announced what he believed to be the beginning of a new day. The letter arrived on a Wednesday in early December. It was handwritten, which was the first thing I noticed, because Nathan had not written anything by hand to me since he was a child, leaving notes on the kitchen counter when he got home from school before I arrived from work. The handwriting was slightly unsteady, which might have been the circumstances, and might have just been that Nathan had never been a particularly good writer. It was 4 pages long. I read it at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. He didn't make excuses, which surprised me. Or rather, he made them and then crossed them out, which I could see in the places where the pen had moved back over words and pressed harder, as if he'd written a justification and then thought better of it and tried to remove it, imperfectly. There were 3 or 4 such places in the letter. They told me more about the state he was in than the words that survived. He wrote about Victoria. He wrote that he knew I would assume she was the architect, and that it wasn't entirely wrong, but that he needed me to understand that he had made choices, his word, underlined once, that he couldn't put on anyone else, that she had presented the opportunity, but he had decided to take it. He had decided. He wrote about money, about the pressure he'd felt for years to appear successful, to appear to have built something, to not be the man who was coasting on his mother's quiet prosperity while she pretended to be a simple country widow. He wrote that somewhere along the way he had started to feel, and this was the word he used, feel, not think, that the money should have been his anyway, that it was family money, that he was the only family left. He wrote, "I know that doesn't make any of it right. I'm not saying it to excuse it. I'm saying it because you always told me the truth mattered even when it was ugly, and I'm trying to do that now. I don't know if I'm doing it right. I probably should have learned how to do it earlier." He wrote, "Near the end, you were the most capable person I have ever known, and I watched you make yourself small so I wouldn't feel inadequate next to you, and instead of being grateful for that, I resented you for it. That's the ugliest thing I've ever said about myself, and I know it. I'm sorry, Mom. I don't know what that's worth right now. Maybe nothing, maybe something later. I don't know." I read the letter twice. The second time I let myself feel it fully. The grief, the anger, the complicated sorrow of a mother reading her child's accounting of himself. The parts of it that were clearly true, and the parts that were still, even in confession, slightly arranged. He was not a perfectly honest man, even in his letter of honesty. But he was trying, and trying imperfectly was something. I folded the letter and put it back in its envelope. I didn't respond that day. I put the envelope in the folder marked Nathan, Correspondence, the same folder where I'd kept his decoy power of attorney, and I went out to the porch and sat in the December cold and looked at the field and thought about what I was going to do with the rest of my life. Not as Nathan's mother, not as a victim, not as the woman in the center of a federal fraud case. just as Evelyn Ruth Hartwell, 72 years old, owner of 43 acres and one farmhouse with a left burner that ran a little hot, keeper of flower beds that were dormant now but would come back in March, driver of an old pickup that a 12-year-old boy had asked her questions about for an entire afternoon. What was I going to do? I sat in the cold and I didn't have an answer yet, and I decided that was all right. The answers were coming. I had done the hard part. I had held the line. I had protected the thing that mattered when someone I loved had tried to take it from me. And I had done it not with bitterness or fury, but with patience and clarity and the kind of quiet determination that people overlook in women of a certain age, because they've decided that quiet means soft and soft means manageable. I had been none of those things. And the people who had underestimated me were now in the middle of a federal prosecution that was going to follow them for years. The December air was sharp and clear. Across the fence, Harold's barn was warm and lit. The sycamore stood in its bare winter shape against the sky. I pulled my cardigan tighter, and I sat there in the cold, on the porch of my house, for as long as I wanted to. Winter settled over the farm the way it always does in Tennessee. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually and without apology. The mornings got harder to get out of bed for. The field went from brown to the particular colorless gray of dormant ground, and the flower beds along the front porch were bare stalks and turned soil, waiting for something that wouldn't come for months. I had always been a person who found winter difficult. Not in a way I talked about much. It wasn't depression exactly, more like a low-grade endurance, a getting through it. Robert used to say I was a spring person trapped in a four-season climate, and he wasn't wrong, every year from November to March. I kept myself going with projects, with routines, with the deliberate construction of reasons to move through the day. This winter, for the first time in as long as I could remember, I had more reasons than I knew what to do with. The trial preparation alone was a kind of full-time occupation. Margaret called 2 or 3 times a week. Carl sent documents requiring my review. The prosecutor's office, a woman named Assistant U.S. Attorney Linda Marsh, who was 39 years old, direct to the point of occasional bluntness, and who I liked immediately, had me in for 3 separate sessions to go through my testimony in preparation for the deposition phase. Each session lasted several hours. I drove myself to Nashville for all of them, in the old pickup, because I was not about to ask anyone to drive me to something I was perfectly capable of managing myself. Linda Marsh had a way of asking the same question from 4 different directions until she was certain she understood every facet of the answer, which was occasionally exhausting and consistently effective. By the 3rd session, I felt like I could describe the sequence of events, from Nathan's first probing question about selling the farmland 2 years before the arrest, through the forged documents, through the recorded conversations, through the morning in my living room, with the precision and consistency of a person who had told the truth so many times it had become almost structural, like the frame of a building. "You're a good witness," she told me at the end of the 3rd session. "I've been telling this story for months," I said. "I ought to be." "It's not just about familiarity," she said. "Some people who've been through what you've been through, they want the jury to feel their pain. They lean on the emotional side and lose the factual clarity. You don't do that. You're both. You have the emotional truth and the specific detail. That combination is hard to shake on cross-examination." I told her I appreciated that, and I meant it. But I drove home thinking about what she'd said, about people who want the jury to feel their pain. I understood that impulse. There had been moments in those sessions when the facts I was reciting had weight in them that was hard to keep out of my voice. The moment I described watching Nathan walk back to the silver SUV the first morning, the moment I read back the phrase Victoria had used, "once the old woman is settled in," I had felt the heat of it move through me and had to breathe through it without letting it pull me under. That was the discipline nobody talked about. Not the legal discipline, not the procedural discipline. The emotional discipline of a person who has decided that their grief and their anger are their own, not material for someone else's defense strategy. Because the moment you let a skilled attorney see where the live wire is, they'll grab it with both hands. I kept my live wires to myself. I always had. Franklin called me on a Wednesday afternoon in January. He'd been speaking with Carl regularly, and his case had been formally incorporated into the federal prosecution as a companion matter, which meant that his lost hardware store, the one his father had built and he had continued for 40 years, was now part of the documented pattern that the prosecution was using to establish the scope and intentionality of the network. He called to tell me that he'd given his deposition. "How was it?" I asked. "Hard," he said, "in the way that things are hard when you have to say them out loud in a formal setting, when it's on record, when you can't take it back." "Yes," I said. "But also," he paused. "I don't know how to describe it exactly. Like putting something down that you've been carrying so long you'd started to think it was just part of your body." I knew that feeling. I'd felt it the morning of the arrests, sitting in my living room in the stillness after the door closed and the cars left. The sensation of weight releasing that was so gradual, you didn't realize how heavy it had been until it was gone. "How are you, Franklin?" I asked. Not about the case, just about him. He was quiet for a moment. "I went back to the property last week," he said. "The hardware store. The new owners, the people Meridian sold it to, who didn't know what it had been, they're running a landscaping supply business out of the front half. The back half is storage." Another pause. "I stood on the sidewalk outside for about 20 minutes, just stood there." "Was that hard?" "Yes," he said simply. "But also, I needed to see that it still existed, that it wasn't gone, that whoever took it from me took the papers, took the title, but they couldn't take what the building was, what it meant. It's still there. The walls are still there. The window my father put in 1962 is still there. I looked out my own kitchen window at the field and the sycamore and the fence line." "I know what you mean," I said. We talked for an hour about his daughter who had moved back near him since everything happened and was, he said, cooking him dinner 3 times a week and being very careful not to make it feel like charity. About a community organization he'd been approached by, a local senior advocacy group that had heard about the case and wanted him to speak at an event in the spring. About the particular way that having been through something terrible could, if you were careful about it and chose consciously, become something you offered to other people instead of something you carried alone. I recognized all of it. It was the conversation I'd been having with myself for weeks, shaped into words by someone else. After I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a while and thought about the spring. February brought the preliminary hearings. Douglas Hale, as Carl had predicted, was attempting to negotiate. He had offered information about the operational structure of the network in exchange for charge reductions, names, transaction records, the specific roles of various participants. Linda Marsh called me to explain what was happening in terms I could follow, and to tell me that regardless of what Hale offered, my case remained the anchor of the prosecution because of the quality of the documentation. "He can give us information we might find useful," she said, "but he can't give us anything that changes what happened to you or what you documented. His cooperation doesn't help his participants. Nathan, Victoria, Foss, they're not getting a benefit from whatever Hale negotiates." "Good," I said. Victoria's separate defense strategy, the one Carl had told me meant she was preparing to claim peripheral involvement and limited awareness, had encountered a specific problem. The audio recording from Victoria's solo visit to my farmhouse, the one where she'd sat in my living room with her candles and her careful performance of honesty and discussed the timeline and used the phrase, "making this transition as comfortable for you as possible," combined with the other recording from the Saturday visit, gave the prosecution what Linda called a documented pattern of active participation that was very difficult to present as passive or unknowing. She knew, Linda told me. She knew exactly what she was doing, and we can demonstrate that. Nathan had, in January, changed his plea. Margaret told me on a Tuesday morning he had agreed to cooperate with the prosecution in exchange for a plea arrangement, not immunity, not a slap on the wrist, but a structured agreement that would result in a significantly reduced sentence in exchange for his full testimony about the network's operation, his own role, Victoria's role, and every communication he'd had with Douglas Hale and Gerald Foss. "He gave them everything," Margaret said. "Carl says he was thorough, more thorough than they expected." I sat with that. My son, who had spent months constructing a scheme to take my home, had ultimately cooperated fully with the prosecution of the people he'd been working with. I didn't know what to make of that morally. It wasn't redemption. It was pragmatic self-preservation, and I had no illusions about the difference. But it also meant that the people who had built the structure Nathan had stepped into, Hale, Foss, the network of title companies and corrupt notaries and shell corporations, were going to face the full weight of what they'd built, with Nathan's detailed testimony as part of the evidence against them. Whatever he had done, and however self-serving his cooperation was, it was going to help Franklin. It was going to help Ruth. It was going to help the retired school teacher who had lost her home of 37 years, and the widower who'd been recovering from surgery when his property was transferred. It was going to help all 9 of them, and possibly more that hadn't been identified yet. I noted that and set it in its proper place. It didn't excuse anything, but it was true, and true things deserve to be acknowledged regardless of how complicated they sit. March came. The flower beds came back the way they always do. Slowly, stubbornly, with the particular insistence of living things that have been dormant and are now emphatically done being dormant. I spent a Saturday morning on my knees in the front beds, pulling winter debris away from the early growth, finding the first pale shoots of the plants I'd tended for years. There is something about that specific task, clearing away the dead material to reveal what survived underneath, that I am not going to belabor into a metaphor, because some things speak clearly enough without assistance. I had agreed in late February to speak at the senior advocacy event that Franklin had mentioned. It was organized by a nonprofit called the Elder Rights Coalition, a group I hadn't known existed before all of this, but which had been doing quiet, essential work for years, helping older adults navigate financial exploitation, legal manipulation, and the specific institutional failures that allowed schemes like Hale's to operate for as long as they did. The event was in Clarksburg, at the community center downtown, a Saturday afternoon in March. I wore my good navy blazer and drove myself. There were about 60 people in the room, some of them victims or family members of victims, some of them attorneys and advocates, some of them local officials, some of them simply older residents who had heard about the event and wanted to understand what was happening in their community. Franklin was there, in the second row, and he raised a hand when I came in, a small, understated gesture that I appreciated. Ruth was there too. I recognized her from a photograph Carl had shared. 81 years old, small and upright, with white hair cut close, and an expression that communicated, even at rest, that she was not a woman who tolerated imprecision. She found me before the program started and shook my hand with a firm, decisive grip. "I heard your recordings," she said. "Portions of them," I said. "The prosecution shared the relevant parts." "You played it perfectly," she said. I would have lost my patience. I would have said something. "I almost did," I said honestly. "Several times." "But you didn't." "No." She looked at me for a moment with the direct, evaluating gaze of a woman who has decided to take the measure of someone and intends to do it accurately. Then she nodded once, as if she'd confirmed something. "Good," she said, and went to find her seat. I spoke for about 35 minutes. I had prepared notes, but I didn't use them much. The story had been inside me long enough that it came out in the order it needed to come out in, without needing external structure. I told them what had happened to me, specifically. I told them about the forged documents, and the decoy power of attorney, and the story about my memory, and the fruit basket, and the candles. I told them about sitting at my kitchen table at 3 in the morning with my documents spread out in front of me, not because I didn't believe them, but because I needed to hold them. I told them about calling Margaret, about Carl, about Agent Downs. And then I told them the part that I thought mattered most, which was not the part about how I fought back. It was the part about what almost stopped me from fighting back at all. The most dangerous thing they did, I said, was not the forgery. Forgery is a crime you can document. The most dangerous thing was subtler than that. It was the slow, consistent effort to make me doubt my own perception. To tell me, in different ways, over months, that I was confused, that I was forgetful, that my understanding of events was less reliable than the documents they were producing. They were building a story in which I was not a credible witness to my own life. I paused. And the reason that strategy works, the reason it works on so many people, is that we have been taught, as we get older, to wonder whether that story might be true. We are surrounded by a culture that associates age with diminishment, that treats the slowing down of a body as evidence of the slowing down of a mind, that mistakes patience for confusion and quiet for weakness and a modest life for an empty one. And when someone who is supposed to love you starts telling you that your memory is unreliable, that you can't be trusted to manage your own affairs, that you need to be taken care of, There is a voice in the back of your head that is ready to believe them, because that voice has been prepared by a lifetime of messages that said, "You are old now, and old means less." The room was quiet. I want to say something directly to anyone in this room who is older and who recognizes what I'm describing, I said. That voice is lying to you. Your perception of your own life is the most reliable information you have. If something feels wrong, it is worth trusting that feeling. It is worth making one phone call, keeping one document, telling one person you trust. The people who prey on older adults are counting on you to talk yourself out of your own instincts. Don't give them that. I looked out at the room, at Franklin in the second row, at Ruth in the third, at the faces of people I didn't know but recognized, the particular recognition of people who have experienced something and are sitting in a room where someone else is naming it accurately for the first time. You are not too old to protect yourself, I said. You are not too old to be taken seriously, and you are not too old to win. I sat down. The applause lasted longer than I expected and louder, and I sat through it feeling something that, I'll be honest, I don't have a perfectly clean word for. It wasn't pride, or not only pride, it was something more specific. The feeling of having done a thing that you didn't know you were capable of, and finding, on the other side of it, that it was the right thing, the necessary thing, the thing that the situation required from exactly the person you happened to be. The sentencing happened in April. Douglas Hale received 14 years in federal prison. His cooperation had resulted in some reduction from the maximum, but the scope and duration of the operation, a decade, $12 million, dozens of victims, had not been overlooked by the judge. Carl told me afterward that the judge had made a specific statement from the bench about the particular nature of the crime, the deliberate targeting of people at a stage of life when they were least equipped to defend themselves, and the cold institutional efficiency with which it had been executed. Gerald Foss was disbarred and received 7 years. His attorney had argued for leniency on the grounds that he had been, in essence, a sophisticated tool of the larger operation. The judge had found this argument moderately unpersuasive. Victoria received 4 years, with 2 of them suspended contingent on cooperation and restitution. Her separate defense strategy had not ultimately survived the audio recordings. The phrase, "once the old woman is settled in," had been played in court, and Linda Marsh had told me afterward that the jury's response to hearing it had been, her word, unmistakable. Nathan received 3 years, with 18 months suspended, in recognition of his cooperation with the prosecution. He would serve the remaining time and then face a period of supervised release. He was also ordered, along with the other defendants, to pay restitution, amounts that, honestly, would not come close to making whole what had been taken from the people they'd targeted, but which were the best the legal system had to offer, and which meant something regardless. Margaret called me after the sentencing. "Are you all right?" she asked. "Yes," I said. Truthfully, I thought about it. "I don't feel what I thought I'd feel," I said. "I thought I'd feel, I don't know, more finished, like a door closing, but it doesn't feel like that." "What does it feel like?" "Like an accounting," I said. "Like the ledger has been looked at and the numbers have been recorded, but the ledger doesn't disappear." "No," Margaret said, "it doesn't." "I'll be okay," I said. "I know you will," she said. "You've been okay through considerably harder things." She wasn't wrong. I wrote Nathan a letter the week after sentencing. Not because I owed it to him, not because I had forgiven him in the clean, resolved way of stories that tie themselves up neatly, but because I had things to say that I needed to say, and I had always believed that things worth saying were worth saying directly, even when they were complicated, even when they didn't come out perfectly shaped. I told him that I loved him. I said it clearly, without qualification, because it was true, and because it deserved to be said plainly instead of buried or hedged. I told him that love and accountability were not opposites, that you could love someone and still require them to face the full weight of what they had done, that the worst thing I could have done for him, in the long run, would have been to protect him from consequences that were his to bear. I told him that I thought about the boy he'd been, not to make either of us feel better, but because he existed, that boy. He was real, and he was part of the full picture of who Nathan was. And the full picture mattered even when parts of it were ugly. I told him that I didn't know what came after this for us, that I wasn't going to make promises I couldn't keep about the future of our relationship, because I had spent too much of my life maintaining the appearance of a relationship for the comfort of other people. That if there was going to be something real between us on the other side of all this, it was going to have to be built from honesty on both sides, without performance and without the particular kind of love that asks nothing and therefore changes nothing. I told him that I had thought many times about the part of his letter where he wrote that he'd watched me make myself small so he wouldn't feel inadequate next to me. I wrote, "I want you to know that I'm not going to do that anymore. Not for you, not for anyone. The woman you tried to put in Maplewood Gardens was never the woman I actually was. She was the version of me that I allowed to exist in your presence because I thought it was easier. I was wrong about that. Easy is not the same as kind. And a kindness that costs someone their honesty is not a kindness. It's a transaction." I told him I hoped to use the time to think, not to plan, not to manage, not to calculate the next move. Just to think about what kind of person he wanted to be when he came out the other side. About whether the man who had written that letter in the holding facility was someone worth becoming, or just someone he'd performed in a moment of consequence. I closed by saying that I would write again, and that I hoped he would write back, and that we would see what there was to work with. I sealed the envelope and mailed it the same morning. I didn't know what he would do with it. I still don't, entirely. But I knew what I'd done with it, which was to say the truth as clearly as I could without cruelty and without softening it into something less than it was. That was all I had to offer. It was the most honest thing I knew how to do. In May, the Elder Rights Coalition asked me to join their advisory board. The woman who called was named Patricia, not Agent Downs, a different Patricia, the coalition's director, who had the particular energy of someone who had been doing important work for a long time with insufficient resources and had learned to be efficient with both her time and her enthusiasm. She explained what the board did, what the time commitment looked like, what she hoped someone with my experience could contribute. "Mrs. Hartwell," she said at the end of her explanation, "I want to be direct. We have attorneys and advocates and policy people on this board. What we don't have enough of is people who have been through it, who can look at a new case and say, yes, I recognize this pattern, here's what matters, here's what they're trying to do. That knowledge it's not replaceable by professional training. It comes from experience." "I'm 72 years old," I said. "I want to be clear about that." "I know," she said. "I also know that you ran a case that took down a 10-year fraud network and resulted in 14 federal convictions. I think we can work around the age." I almost laughed. "When does the board meet?" I asked. She told me. "Monthly, with additional calls as needed. Manageable. Not so demanding that I couldn't continue what I was doing on the farm, couldn't continue my Tuesday coffees with Dorothy, couldn't continue the conversations I'd been having with Franklin and Ruth and the others. Informal, unscheduled, simply present when someone needed someone who understood." "I'll do it," I said. She asked if I was sure. "Patricia," I said, "I spent 6 years being sure about things quietly, in private, where nobody saw. I'm done doing that. Yes, I'm sure." Summer arrived the way. Summer arrives in Tennessee, suddenly, aggressively, and without any particular concern for your preferences. The flower beds were full again. The front porch had its morning shadow that I sat in with my coffee, the left burner on the stove still running a little hot, the old pickup still making the sound it made when the engine was cold and needed a minute. The field was green and alive. Robert's sycamore was full and wide and casting its particular shade over the eastern corner of the yard. Dorothy came for coffee on Tuesdays, as she always had. Harold remained confused about sunrise. The coalition board met in June and then in July, and I drove myself to both. And in both rooms I said what I thought in the direct way I had decided was the only way I was doing things anymore. And nobody tried to manage me or soften what I was saying or look at me with the patient condescension of people who had already decided how much weight a woman of my age was capable of carrying. Carl called in July to tell me that the restitution payments had begun processing. A slow, imperfect mechanism, given the complexity of the financial web that had to be unwound, but moving. Franklin's case was at the front of the line. Ruth's was close behind. "It's not everything," Carl said. "You know that." "I know," I said. "It's something." "Yeah, it's something." Agent Downs reached out by email in August. Formal, professional, a brief note saying that she wanted me to know the case had been cited in a new federal guidance document on elder financial exploitation as an example of effective victim documentation. My yellow legal pads, my fireproof box, my original documents, the recordings from my cardigan pocket, all of it. Now apparently part of a guide being distributed to field offices on how to build cases in this area. I read the email twice and then wrote back a brief, genuine response saying I was glad it had been useful. What I thought about, after I sent that response, was not the federal guidance document. It was the Tuesday morning I had sat at this same kitchen table at 3 a.m. with the document spread out in front of me. The cold of the kitchen, the particular quality of that hour, the fear that I'd been trying not to name because naming it would have made it too real. I had been afraid. I want to say that clearly because I think the story of a person who fights back can sometimes erase the fear that preceded the fight, and that erasure is dishonest. I had been afraid in a way that sat in my chest for weeks and made the ordinary weight of the day heavier. Afraid that I would lose. Afraid that I was wrong about what I remembered. Afraid that the people who were building a story about my confusion would, eventually, convince enough of the right people that their version was real. Fear is not weakness. That's the thing I want you to understand. Fear is the appropriate response to a real threat. The question is not whether you feel it. The question is what you do while you feel it. And what I did, what I chose to do imperfectly, with help, stumbling in places, exhausted in others, was to keep moving. To make one more phone call, to keep one more document, to answer one more text with the performance they needed to see while the real work happened somewhere they couldn't monitor. That's all any of us can do. One more phone call, one more decision not to be silent. In September, I drove out to the eastern field on a Saturday morning, parked the pickup at the edge of the property line, and walked the fence. I hadn't done it in years. Robert and I used to walk the perimeter together in the spring, checking posts, looking for damage from winter, the particular satisfaction of knowing the edges of what was yours. I had stopped after he died because it was too much his kind of thing, too saturated with the memory of him at my side talking about the soil or the weather or the plan for the summer. I walked it alone. It took 45 minutes at my pace, which is not what it once was, but is still steady on flat ground. The morning was cool and clear, the sky that particular September blue that seems closer than sky has any right to be. The field was late summer gold. The posts were in reasonable condition. Harold's grandson had helped me repair 3 of them in the spring, and they were solid. I walked the full perimeter without stopping, all 43 acres. The corners, the fence line along the county road, the back stretch where the land drops slightly toward the creek bed, the eastern edge where the sycamore stands. At the sycamore I stopped. I put my hand on the bark. It was rough and warm from the morning sun. The tree was broad and stable in the way of things that have been growing for a long time, that have put their roots down deep enough that surface disturbances don't reach the essential part. I thought about Robert planting it the year Nathan was born. I thought about the boy who had never climbed it. I thought about the woman who had almost been relocated to a room at Maplewood Gardens while this tree continued to grow on land that would have been sold to fund someone else's life. I thought about everything that had happened in the past year, the fear and the work and the grief and the fight, and the people I'd found along the way who had become, in the particular way that unexpected connections become, important to me. Franklin with his flat, honest voice and his father's hardware store window. Ruth with her journal and her decisive handshake. Margaret, who had known me for 30 years and never once treated me as anything less than fully capable. Carl, who had told me what I needed to know without softening it. Agent Downs, who had said that's rare and meant it as a statement of fact, not a compliment designed to make me feel better. Dorothy, who brought casseroles and told me to stop thanking her and stayed until she decided it was appropriate to leave. I thought about all of it, standing with my hand on the bark of a tree planted by a man I had loved for 30 years. And I thought about something else too, something I hadn't fully let myself think about until this moment. About what this year had cost me and what it had given me and whether those were separable things. It had cost me the illusion of a family I thought I had. The comfortable fiction that my son was a good man who had made some bad choices, rather than a man who was capable of looking his mother in the eyes and lying to her face and building a scheme over 2 years to take everything she had. It had cost me the particular peace of not knowing. There is a certain kind of peace in not knowing things, in keeping the version of someone you love alive through careful inattention to the evidence. I had lost that peace, and I wasn't going to get it back. But here's what I gained, and I am not going to be sentimental about it, because the truth of it is stronger than sentimentality. I gained myself back. The version of Evelyn Hartwell who had made herself small so other people would feel comfortable, who had kept her knowledge quiet and her capabilities modest and her wealth invisible because she didn't want to be the kind of woman who made people feel inadequate, who had adjusted and accommodated and forgiven and bent and held her tongue in the service of relationships that were, in too many cases, operating on a fundamental misunderstanding of who she actually was. That version of me didn't survive the year. And in her place was this, a 72-year-old woman who had walked 43 acres on a September morning in a state that still belonged to her, who was on the advisory board of an organization that was working to protect people who looked like her, who had been through what she'd been through, who had made some things possible for Franklin and Ruth and the others that they might not have been able to make possible for themselves, who had sat in front of 60 people in a community center and said the true thing, plainly, without decorating it, who still made biscuits from scratch, who still ran the left burner a little hot, who still couldn't get the east side fence post to stop leaning slightly, regardless of how many times it was repaired, who was, imperfectly and completely, and for the first time in longer than she could exactly identify, herself. I want to say something to you, whoever you are, before this story is finished, because I think it would be wrong to get to the end of this without being direct about the things that actually matter. If you are older and someone is telling you that you don't understand your own life, that your memory is failing, that your judgment can't be trusted, that you need to be managed and relocated and reduced to a schedule in a room with a garden view, I want you to listen to the part of you that is resisting that story. That resistance is not confusion. That resistance is not aging. That resistance is you, knowing yourself, refusing the version of your life that someone else has decided is more convenient than the real one. Protect your documents. Talk to an attorney whose loyalty is to you and no one else. Tell someone you trust what is happening, even if it feels like too much, even if you're not sure yet, even if you're still hoping you're wrong. Because the hoping you're wrong phase is exactly the phase they're counting on. If you are watching someone you love go through this, if you are the Dorothy in someone else's story, the neighbor who sees something and isn't sure whether to say something, bring the casserole, show up, ask the direct question, let them tell you no, they're fine, before you believe that they're fine. The most important thing I had, beyond Margaret and Carl and Agent Downs, was a woman next door who came over with a dish covered in aluminum foil and stayed until she decided it was appropriate to leave. That matters. It matters enormously, more than it gets credit for. And if you are somewhere in the middle of your own version of this, if you are sitting at a kitchen table at 3 in the morning with your documents spread out in front of you, afraid, not sure of the next step, wondering if you have what it takes to fight something this large, I want you to know that I was sitting in that same chair. I was not certain. I was not fearless. I was not the version of a strong woman that stories present to make strength seem like a natural attribute rather than a daily decision. I was afraid and tired and grieving a relationship I had already, in some deep part of myself, understood was not what I had believed it to be. But I made the next phone call, and then the one after that. And I kept the documents, and I played the role, and I recorded the conversations from the pocket of my cardigan, and I answered the text messages with the warm, slightly vague responses of a woman who had already decided to fight, and I did not stop. That is all I did. That is all any of us can do. Not perfectly, not without fear, not without help, but we keep going. Well, the October morning came around again, the way October always does, sharp and clear and honest, the way the air gets when the warmth is finished and the world is showing you exactly what it is. I stood on the front porch with my coffee. The flower beds were going dormant again, the last of the season fading back into the soil for the winter. The field was changing color. Robert's sycamore was beginning to show its bones through the thinning leaves. 1 full year. A year since the silver SUV had pulled into this driveway, and a woman in a silk blouse had looked at my kitchen like she was pricing the square footage. I thought about that morning. I thought about all the mornings since. I drank my coffee. Harold's rooster made his faithful, incorrect announcement down the road. The Tennessee morning stretched out around me, unhurried and indifferent and beautiful in the specific way of things that have been here longer than any human trouble and will be here long after. I was 72 years old. I was standing on my porch, in front of my house, on my land. I had been underestimated by people who thought my age was a vulnerability, my patience was passivity, my quiet life was evidence of an empty one. They found out differently. And I want you to remember that. Whoever you are, whatever version of this you're living or watching or fearing, the person that everyone underestimates is sometimes the person who has spent a lifetime building something that nobody thought to look at closely enough to understand. Don't let anyone tell you what you're worth. Don't let anyone tell you what you're capable of. And don't you dare let anyone, Mom. Not a stranger, not an institution, not even someone who carries your blood and calls you by your name. Don't let anyone talk you out of the life you built. It belongs to you. It has always belonged to you. And there is no age at which that stops being true.